Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Merlin Donald here. He's a very deep thinker. You know, I've been tremendously influenced by Julian Jaynes. And after Julian Jaynes, I think Merlin Donald is able to spell out how has human consciousness changed with culture and with technology better than anybody else have seen. So I'm really excited about talking to Merlin. Welcome, Merlin.
Thank you.
So Merlin, how did you get interested in figuring out about human beings?
Well, I was an undergraduate in a Jesuit college when I was young, and I had a very broad classical education. I focused a lot on classics and on philosophy and on literature, but I had a minor in biology, but I never had a single course in psychology. I didn't study it until I was a graduate student, and in a sense, I was entering the world of the enemy. From my perspective, psychology was ridiculously deterministic and simplistic to the point of almost disrespecting its subjects. But that was because, to some degree, that was the time of behaviorism was still dominant. And basically, what behaviorism does, from the point of view of an ethologist, is strip away all the cleverness of the animal, the whole environment, put him in a box, give him nothing to do except press a bar, bore him out of his skull, and then starve him. And lo and behold, he'll do anything you program him to do. But I did discover after a while that the cognitive revolution in neuroscience and so on, and that's where I went. But there is an awful tendency, even in neuroscience, to disrespect culture, or not to give it sufficient attention. And so, for a long time, I did straight neuroscience and neuropsychology. I was a clinical neuropsychologist for a while. And then I started piecing it all together in my 40s to try to define human nature from my perspective. And that's basically been my interest for a very long time.
Wow. So let's dive into it. Now, you talk about different stages of human cultural evolution.
Yes.
What are the stages?
Well, it depends on how you want to phrase it, but I've singled out three uniquely human phases. And I think the date I gave in my first book was a bit off, because the archaeology of the time suggested that stone tools can only be associated with Homo habilis, which is around 2 million years ago. But it turns out now that we can draw them back into the Afarensis australopithecines back about 3.5 million years ago, where the evidence consists of cut marks on bones. It was clear they were butchering animals using some kind of a tool, and very careful studies by Francisco D'Erico with a tunneling electron microscope identified those as cut marks from stone on bone. So that says we've been at this a long time. We've been tool makers and tool users for 3.5 million years. That's a long time, even by evolutionary standards. And of course, at that time, our ancestors were still very much in the great ape line in appearance and in the way they operated. But I built my whole theory around the notion that we were skilled for a very long time before we were articulate, and that's a really key thing. So what does that mean? Well, I elaborated the concept of skill in the light of a lot of experimental work. And it's not simple to become skills. The strange thing is that a very clever ape or a dog who's enormously smart will not even think of, for example, pointing to his mouth to indicate that he's hungry. Why is that? He's capable of doing it, but he won't. There is no drive towards representation, and Um, we can't create a culture that is cognitive in nature until you can produce public displays, public representations. And they were doing, I believe that skill implies refined skill, the ability to practice and rehearse implies that ipso facto, you have the neurological basis for simple gestures and pantomime. So I've called it mimetic
Mm-hmm.
because from the earliest days, we were people who assimilated an identity by looking at other people, basically. You see a hero and you want to be like him, or you see uh, something beautiful and you want to be that, or whatever. It has a profound implication. Once you can uh, pantomime your previous actions and modify them towards a goal, you've taken the first step towards being human and doing something that no other creature can do. So that was, I think, a kind of breakthrough notion. Mimesis and mimetic culture,
Mm-hmm.
of course, it started to evolve way back then. Of course, it kept evolving even after language came and so on and so on, until very recently. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the cerebellum, which is most of the neurons in the brain, more than the cortex, it was actually continued to become more elaborated even in our species compared
Mm-hmm.
with, let's say, the Homo antecessor, so that's important, and that's confirmation of the notion of mimesis is key to human nature, and
Wow.
I think everything else is scaffolded on that
Mm-hmm.
until you realize that we have thousands and thousands of skills that are refined acquired skills. Just making breakfast in the morning, sometimes I went around and photographed
Mm-hmm.
all the things I did in the first day and the first hour of the day. And it's complicated. It's a very complex
Mm-hmm.
world. We don't just have skills, we have entire algorithms of hierarchized skills in which we do things on automatic. What Kahneman and Tversky called System One, which was
Yes.
just another word for automatized behavior. But I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they're economists.
Wow.
they take liberties.
Mm-hmm.
But and System Two basically is conscious behavior. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
which was necessary to refine a tool. You have to attend to your inner uh, actions, your inner control systems. So you have to be able to monitor yourself
Mm-hmm.
in order to make a good tool. It takes a PhD anthropologist, 3 weeks of practice,
Mm-hmm.
even today.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine 3.5 million years ago, it might have been a somewhat exotic skill, but the fact
Mm-hmm.
that they found any is quite remarkable that are that old.
Wow.
It suggests that there might have been quite a few. By 2 million years ago,
Mm-hmm.
we have a much more human looking creature called Homo erectus,
Mm-hmm.
who has bigger brain, of course, at this point. And I've argued that tool use actually was one of the things that triggered the growth of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, Richard Wrangham has the idea that it's also related to diet and evidence
Mm-hmm.
that we might have had fire as early as 2 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We know we had fire 1 million years ago. So all of these things suggest that there was a gradualistic, very Darwinian process going on for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere around a million and a half years ago, we started looking and acting a lot more human. I suspect that at that point in mimetic culture, people had the equivalent of home signs. Possibly the vocal tract had started to
Mm-hmm.
descend and to move, towards language. I don't think we had full-fledged language until much more recently, quarter million maybe years
Mm-hmm.
ago, but possibly the Neanderthals had a degree of language, maybe a lot of
Mm-hmm.
language, but certainly I had a very animated discussion with some Israeli archaeologists back in about a year ago in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University,
Mm-hmm.
where we had a week-long meeting, and they have a site called GBY where they found evidence that a million years ago they were catching fish with weirs,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, what they found was in the sediment of what was formerly the bottom of a water body of water, they found uh, not just randomly distributed fish bones, which is what you find almost everywhere, but just fish heads, and they were carbonized.
Mm.
So they were cooking fish,
Wow.
and that implies a whole lot of
Mm-hmm.
things,
Wow.
cooperation, sustained use
Mm-hmm.
of fire, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of other evidence now that pushes fire well back in time.
Mm-hmm.
So in comparison with where I was 30 years ago when I was writing Origins of Modern Mind, things are older, which makes a much better case
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of time to evolve. And during that time, I think language was starting to come in, but
Mm-hmm.
in a very rudimentary way.
So
Just
where do you place the move to the mythic
well,
culture?
the mythic would come only when that's an interesting point because you can have some words the way a young child does without having language, full language. I define full language as you being able to tell your own story,
Mm-hmm.
an original story. So I went to the grocery store. Mommy is an original story,
Mm-hmm.
where, and that only comes to a child after age 4 usually.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, it's children have a lot of speech before that, but they don't have ability. Once you can tell a story um, in culture and it becomes elaborated across generations, you have the possibility of myth, of very deep, uh, ruling stories that, in a sense, become governing structures. I use the word cognitive governance because they are assumed by everybody, and they form a basis for an articulate culture, and that's when what I call mythic culture would begin. Uh, and that's also the possibility of autobiographical memory. So the self becomes greatly elaborated at that point from where it started. So, and even there, as James pointed out, of course, and others, I was very influenced by Northrop Frye, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
and the use of the word mimetic culture, which is an Aristotelian term, but
Mm-hmm.
it is very much a product of having become, as I later realized, I probably knew more about Frye than Frye did at that
Mm-hmm.
point, because a lot of my students have known more about my work than I did in many senses, because you
Mm-hmm.
can only be aware of so much. But so mimetic is, he had, of course, regarded Elizabethan culture as high mimetic for very different reasons. He was a literary scholar, but um, the concept of mimetic versus mythic culture is that you move from um, the global event representation mapping of situations onto your own behavior to formulated ideas in myth, in stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the Bible, in that kind of culture, a very mythic culture, you want to make a moral point, you tell a story. This is the way you behave. Uh, you don't argue as Kant would, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or for that matter, Thomas Aquinas. You actually tell a story, and so you, in a sense, it's an extension of mimetic culture into the mythic realm, because it still becomes a guideline that you can accept or reject for complicated ideas.
Around what time did this happen? When did this happen?
Well, that's very much up in the air. I think hunter-gatherers have myths. There's no question, and that means going way back. But when did they? I would imagine that when we became fully articulate, we had to play with language for a very long time before we exploited it, but I would say that mythic culture is very old in principle, um, but there are many different dimensions of mythic culture. It goes through many stages. I was at Göbekli Tepe a couple of years ago with Trevor Watkins, a very good archaeologist, and that's 12,000 years old. They had all kinds of uh, fully articulated myths, obviously, in that society. This was a huge ceremonial center, like 7,000 years before Stonehenge, um, and much more sophisticated in its construction. And
Wow.
it's still under excavation, although things in Turkey right now are pretty difficult.
Mhm.
But mythic culture is a governing system that can be uh, very broad and could lead to questioning uh, kind of directions, and as we saw, but that took a long time, because if you look at the great epics, Gilgamesh, or the ancient epics, the Odyssey, you're not at that stage yet. It's a mythic culture, undoubtedly, but it's not a questioning one. It's not a
Huh.
there is no great depth to it. It's very could be partly explained by the fact that everybody was so young,
Mhm. Mhm.
but also occupied with survival, and um,
All right. So with that as a background, let's move on to the main part, which is the
mhm.
technology supported cultures.
Yep.
So what was the first technology that really transformed humans?
All right. Here's the thing. There's a key distinction that has to be made between hexagrams and engrams. Engrams is Carl Lashley's word for a memory stored in the brain. So you engrave, you uh, develop pathways. We're not really sure what a complex memory looks like in the brain, but it involves structural change that lasts for a long time, despite the fact that the brain is constantly turning over material and that cells come and go. None of them last very long, but the memories can last a lifetime, even though not a molecule of your brain is the same as it was. So it's very
Mhm.
interesting
Mhm.
fact. But that's an engram. An exogram is completely different, and an exogram is something that is made of another material, non-biological, and it's external to the brain. So I've called it external memory.
Mhm.
Once you have that, the architecture of the mind changes. And the driving idea between a lot of my stages is that the architecture of the mind is changing, which means, of course, that the architecture within which consciousness must function is also changing.
Mhm.
And it changes radically with hexagrams. Hexagrams are permanent, they're searchable in a ways that the brain is not searchable. They are reformatable. They have all kinds of properties that engrams don't have. So they radically change also the options available to the thinker or the speaker or the perceiver. And they are public. So they're laundered through culture, what I call ideal laundering systems. There is no idea, there's no impression that you have as an individual that has not been thoroughly processed with other people, directly or indirectly, over generations. I can have a conversation with Aristotle,
Mhm.
who lived 2,500 years ago.
Mhm.
And writers routinely are influenced by people who are dead, who are long dead, in other cultures, other languages. It's an extraordinary thing. Once you get into the exographic space, radical things can
Mhm.
happen. At the same time, we know, and I wrote a long paper on this some years ago, that there are psychological impacts of hexagrams. They restructure the inside of the brain in a variety of ways. Uh, that was evident even 30 years ago with from neuropsychological evidence, because you can damage your reading brain without affecting your speech brain. It's a separate architecture. You can also damage your writing without affecting your reading. You can get pathologies where you can't read the thing you just wrote, but so there are architectures in the brain that don't exist in non-literate people because they don't, there wasn't the occasion to influence the brain that way. And so that was at the time a fairly radical idea, that hexagrams and an hexagraphic world can restructure the brain itself. Now it's, I think, pretty widely accepted. Some of the work by Stan DeHaan with MRI has thoroughly confirmed all of this. But it was well known anyway, just from the neurological literature, even back into the 19th century. So you have hexagrams are a major influence, and they also are infinite in their capacity, unlike our minds. So you can have an encyclopedia, you can have a library, etc. And the beautiful thing about libraries that are non-digital, by the way, is that you can walk through them in three-dimensional space. So you're actually walking through the noosphere physically, through three dimensions. It's an amazing thing, which you can't do in the digital world. It's linear, so it's actually greatly constraining in that sense, which a lot of digital fanboys don't like to hear.
Let's go through step by step, because I think from Jane's, I mean, one of the biggest things that I got was the power of writing, because I mean, the way I see it, I experience it, is that when you write, you're putting your thoughts outside you.
Yes.
So you're able to actually self-reflect much better. You're able to say, did I capture that precisely enough? How is it related to other things? So it just, go ahead.
Yes, well, reflective thought took a qualitative leap with written texts, and there's no question that your relationship to the idea is utterly changed by being able. And in fact, I write poetry myself, and if you've ever written a poem, you know that the poem speaks to you. It tells you, no, that's not the right line, or that's not the right rhythm, or whatever. Right metaphor. The truth is that the written text has a transformative effect on your mind, and on your ability to reflect it, on your ability to abstract. Oh yes, revolutionary.
So now, during the initial time, only a very tiny fraction of people could read and write, whereas 99.9% of people, probably something, I don't know the exact thing, but it's definitely 99% plus people couldn't. So what is the operation of this culture like, where only some people can do this, who have this amazingly powerful technology of external memory, and everybody else doesn't?
Yeah, that's huge. That's a big issue. Well, I think a number of things here. First of all, when I was young and foolish, I believed, like everybody else in my generation, that making everybody literate would make them all very intelligent and very well informed, and our politics would become much more sophisticated and so on. We now know that's not true. In fact, what happens is it generally dumbs down the idea sphere. You get celebrities who are idiots, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's the truth is that it doesn't raise the overall intelligence of human beings. And to be perfectly blunt, we are very pretentious apes, and we should be a little more humble about what we are, and that includes, by the way, even scientific geniuses, so-called geniuses. I mean, when you look at anybody in the
Mhm.
laboratory, which I've done a lot of over the years, despite myself, the truth is the differences between people who are accepted to be brilliant and those who are not that great.
Mhm.
But I think that what we do is we overestimate the individual. A lot of very brilliant people are in the right place at the right time with the right nervous system. You know, I've compared culture to a search engine.
Mhm.
It's looking for the right mind for a particular job that has to be done. And if that one is found, it would go on to fame and fortune and celebrity and all the rest of it. But it really, overall, is that person that different? Probably not that much. And individually, we aren't very much. I spent a lot of time in Boston years ago at the Perkins Institute studying Helen Keller's story.
Mhm.
It was a very remarkable story. A woman who had encephalitis, they think, at age 18 months, and essentially never learned to speak, had essentially no retina,
Mhm.
no hearing at all, was
Mhm.
living in a dark, silent world,
Mhm.
and for a long time was completely out of control, and yet learned ultimately to read through Braille and through
Mhm.
various other devices that were common at the time, and then eventually wrote 14 books, mostly autobiographical, but nevertheless, what does it mean to think in words in a silent, dark world? You know, and it causes you to rethink what language is all over again, and also to think of what hexagrams are. You know, because what was language to her? It was taught to her through hand signs that monks had used, who had taken a vow of silence.
Mhm.
I mean, uh, so what does that mean? What to think in terms like that? And so we have this incredibly flexible plastic brain, and that's why, of course, I abandoned Chomsky's ideas altogether, because, of
Mhm.
course, it doesn't fit in at all with the idea of a fixed brain module and all that stuff.
So let me come back to this. So I'm trying to see the progression. So clearly, writing is a giant step. I mean, because you can see that internally as well as at a social level, because then you can all the
Well, I mean,
products.
yes, early writing was used for performances. They read out loud in
Mhm.
front of an audience, and the idea of radical was, I guess, Augustine was one of the first people to push that idea that you could read silently, but it still wasn't common until 1,000 years later. Reading silently was considered kind of weird. It was really used initially to perpetuate oral culture,
Mhm.
to train people in the law and so on, but they were expected to practice in oral sense, to memorize everything and so on. And reading was also a very elite skill, comparable perhaps to high level computer programming today, in terms of its role in governing the world. It was something that the advisors to the king would have used for managing budgets and keeping track of wealth and that kind of thing, genealogies, trade. But it was a very exotic, very elite skill. And it meant that the people who governed the written word, had enormous power
Mhm.
over masses and masses of people. Um, and that no longer exists. And that's probably a good thing.
Mhm.
The bad thing is that there's so much chaos out there right now in social media
Mhm.
that they have. It's true they're literate in the sense that they can spell things out, but their concerns are. It's no accident that when the iPhone came along, caught on like wildfire. Up until that point, people were using cell phones mostly for email and for business and for
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things, elite things. But then it went out to the streets, and the internet is basically the back alleys of London in Dickens' time.
Oh,
There's
interesting.
nasty stuff out there as well
Mm-hmm.
as good things, of course.
Now, when I look at language, and when I look at, for example, Greeks, people like Aristotle, the way in which they are using language, they are
Yes.
using it to figure out stuff about the world.
Hmm.
They're trying to make arguments. They're trying to go back and forth
Hmm.
using that. Now, that's a very different use of language than simply writing down a story.
Oh, yes.
What is that? Is that a different? How do you see? What do you see as a distinction between
Well,
writing down a story and the kind of writing that Aristotle
that's moving towards theoretic culture. I have written a lot on that over the years, and especially in the field of the cognitive science of religion, the study of religion. I don't know if you know the work of Bob Bella, but he came out with a very important book about 7 or 8 years, 10 years ago, maybe, with Harvard University Press, called Religion and Evolution. But he built his thing around my theory. Basically, is mostly about the axial age,
Mhm,
the millennium before Christ, when the four major religious traditions in the modern world were formulated, and on the argument that they were moving towards something like theoretic culture.
mhm,
I don't know that I fully agree with that, but I think certainly when you bring up Aristotle and Aquinas and that kind of thing, you're talking about a move towards analytic reasoning, which I think is not innate to the mind. I mean, you have to realize that 50 years ago, people who studied intelligence thought that there was actually a brain module for reasoning. Well, I have the opposite position. I think that what we think of as paradigmatic thought, what Bruder called paradigmatic thought and analytic reasoning, is a cultural invention. It's a set of rules of algorithms that are culturally arbitrary and recent, and very dependent on text, on having printing and having media of various kinds, exographic media,
mhm,
and that it took a long time to come around, that we're naturally very intuitive and irrational, that this is, as Milton said, like taking blood from a stone.
mhm,
We're not naturally analytic reasoners, and not even scientists. You have to be bludgeoned into it
mhm,
and bullied into it,
mhm.
and there have to be strict rules and so on. It's not natural, but so it comes out of reflection. It comes out of reflection on ideas and thoughts. Even on you can reflect on myth, and you can question, let's say, some aspect of a story, of whether it was true, or whether it was profound, or what it implied. And the minute you start doing that, you're moving towards analytic reasoning and
Mhm,
theoretic culture. What I call theoretic culture is, of course, a minority culture even today, as we saw with January 6th,
mhm,
or on Fox News.
mhm,
Analytic culture is theoretic culture is a minority culture, but it's the governing culture. It runs the world.
mhm.
It basically, the entire economic system, most military systems, all technology, et cetera, even though it's a very small minority of people, because it's just so powerful.
Wow. So let's focus on this. This is amazing.
Mhm.
So where do you see kind of when does the theoretic culture can be clearly seen? How far back
Oh,
can you clearly see it?
as I say, that's a hot topic,
Mhm,
because the whole notion of the axial age is a bit loose, but it is true that four major cultural traditions during the 1,000 years before Christ made a move
got
in
it.
the direction of some kind of governance of within the culture, some kind of governance system that was not entirely mythic. Okay,
Mhm,
that is mythic governance is based on prototypes, generalizations from ways to behave of stories, and stereotyped. You know, do you want to be a warrior? You know, and
Mm-hmm.
what is a warrior?
Mm-hmm.
And what is a hero? And what is a villain? And what is uh, a traitor? And
Mm-hmm.
and what is a good mother?
Mm-hmm.
And what is bravery? And that kind of thing. It's all resolved that way through myth, and of course mimetically, which is very closely tied to myth. I mean, one of the things about an emergent theory like this, a cascade theory, is that as you move through time, you retain the past,
Mm-hmm.
and it influences what your options are for change. Now, I think theoretic culture was a very hard one process, and literally very violent process of getting there bit by bit, because with Trump you can see you know the rise of very old-fashioned,
Yes.
totally narcissistic, lunatic leaders
Mm-hmm.
who
Mm-hmm.
are legion in human history. I mean, there's endless stories of people like that
Mm-hmm.
break down the walls of the city and
Mm-hmm.
rule on whim. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, it's coming, and I would argue that is driven by really primitive mammalian
Mm-hmm.
instincts
Mm-hmm.
of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
One time I saw two male sea lions, braying at one another with their mouths wide open,
Mm-hmm.
competition, and they're
Mm-hmm.
breathing out loud and they're going towards one
Mm-hmm.
another.
Mm-hmm.
That's ambition.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
And you may say, well, that's male ambition. Yeah, but it's also female ambition in
Yeah.
a different way. But I mean, yes,
Yeah.
most obvious in competing males. But we still have that. It's still in us. We're still very much primates.
Right. So
But
what you're saying is that there are these layers. There is
these
a deeper
layers.
layer, older layer, and then there are
That's right.
layers at the top.
Hmm.
But the layers at the top, like for example, theoretic culture is at the top, but there are all these other layers, and people can and are operating at all these
Oh
levels
yes.
at the
Well,
same time.
I've said that in my second book on consciousness. I said, there are times when we're mimetic, times when we're mythic, times when we're theoretic. We have all of this within us. It's just that in theoretic culture is very much a group thing. You must be part of a mechanism. We've been building an apparatus of thought that is not individual; it's collective. So you're part, in a way, Merlin Donald is a product of his generation and his place in history. There may be nobody like me in another 50 years. They may not even understand what I'm talking about. In 500 years from now, probably nobody will be speaking English. God knows what the world will be like. I mean, it's a moving target, and we're all very much stamped with time and place. And so analytic culture is delicate. It could be lost. There's no question. It depends on skills. It depends on habits that have to be sustained across generations.
Got it. So now let's look at. So I want to look at analytic culture in detail from many angles. So let's look at analytic culture or theoretic culture in Greece. So what you're
Yes.
saying is that it is Plato's academy, these peripatetic school of Aristotle, where Aristotle and students are walking around,
Mm-hmm.
talking to each other, writing things down, and that entire cultural setting is what is needed to sustain that way of thinking. Is that
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying? That there is this entire cultural, social base that supports that a
Yes.
kind of thinking, kind of use of a consciousness.
Yes. I mean, I think, first of all, Pericles in Athens was really exceptional, even in Greece.
Mm-hmm.
The pre-Socratics were as irrational and loose as any other tradition. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
the Indus Valley tradition or the
Mm-hmm.
Hebraic tradition or anything else. You don't have and Plato is interesting because he's a storyteller and he's putting things into format
Mm-hmm.
that are not all that rigid or analytic. He's a long
Mm-hmm.
way from Kant, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
On the other hand, Aristotle isn't. Aristotle was the real
Right.
leap. It
Yes.
was an extraordinary thing. I mean, 40 volumes on biology. I mean, the guy was
Mm-hmm.
unbelievable, you know.
Yes.
But he is where you see it most clearly. And I've had big disagreements with scholars in the field of classics and religious history and so on, over whether, because sometimes they take the most nuanced thing and they think that's theoretic culture. Well, no, Aristotle came very close, and some of his successors, but it was really a tiny, tiny minority of people among literate people, and the
Mm-hmm.
illiterate didn't have
Mm-hmm.
a clue what this was all about. So I would say that that was a temporary thing. It ended, and the time moved on, and the world was as irrational as ever. However, in the field of technology,
Mm-hmm.
progress was continuously being made. And there was a good article in the LA Review of Books today about a new book that fellow, I think named Spencer, came out with. It's about science and the fact that it has uh, an iron rule of testability, that of verifiability, that is what makes it successful, and nothing else. That scientists as a gang are as irrational as anyone else. I can vouch for that. You know, but but once you're part of this group, you're part of this almost cult, and you obey very rigorously these rules. It's like joining the military or something,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it works. It produces results. But I mean, I have a different take on that, but I'm not sure if you're interested in it.
Please.
Uh, it's that a lot of human uniqueness is in our procedural memories. What what psychologists call procedural memory, which is about skill. So,
Mm-hmm.
learning how to do a swan dive is a procedural memory. How to fix a carburetor, or how to that dates me, doesn't it? Nobody has carburetors anymore. But how to operate a computer or whatever. It's a These are procedural memories that are procedures, things you carry out in order to get a result. Well, that's what science is. It's a massive, massive collection of formulas for getting results.
Mm-hmm.
You want pure oxygen. This is what you do. You know, etc. And that is um, what makes us so effective. Um, and Analytic thought is more correlated to what I call the visionary function, which has traditionally been also the role of religion. The mythic
Mm-hmm.
grand myths are visionary,
Mm-hmm.
and they're also predictive of futures, often wrong, of course. But imagine, Charles Taylor, the philosophy, has a wonderful word that he uses for that, the imaginarium.
Mm-hmm.
The things or the imaginary that we have, that we live in, and that makes life meaningful. And that's both a product of myth, and it's also a product of theoretic thought, but which is uh, different from the the massive accumulation of workable procedural memories that are typical of science. But it's a kind of idiosyncratic view. I've never really written about it, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm just telling
Sure.
you about it now.
Let's talk about science, because we talked about Periclean Athens.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's kind of fast forward to after the printing press,
Yes.
where these ideas can be now distributed far more widely. The
Mm-hmm.
literacy is increasing. It's still not very significant, but still, it's instead of being like 0.1 or some percent, it is now kind of 5%, 10%, something like that. There are scientists, let's say the Royal Society, that is actually communicating.
Right.
They're communicating with each other on a regular basis, and that
Yeah.
is a part. So is that the kind of thing, like, for example, what did printing do to consciousness?
Well, did mass printing make a big difference? Well, it made a big difference in terms of what it could reach and accessibility. But printing had been there for a while, for a couple of thousand years at least, in the form of the illuminated manuscripts and various other papyri and so on, all the way back to Egypt, I suppose, and Sumerians and so on. But printing is it's a change in the mass mentality. Mass culture is almost a product of that. I mean, you can't harmonize or synchronize the thoughts and concerns of millions and millions of people any other way, except, of course, through modern electronic media, which are now into the billions. But I mean, there was a time when cultures were very local because they had no other medium, so no way of distributing ideas. So that's transformative in terms of um, the kind of shared consciousness that people could have, which is somewhat different from your idiosyncratic personal awareness. It's it's a very complicated topic because mass culture is such a weird phenomenon, especially in its modern form. But that's a very recent development. I mean,
Sure.
it's not the printing press didn't really do it. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and probably the 20th century that you had true mass culture. And
Right.
it's actually quite a dangerous development, I think, because the behaviors got their hot little hands
Mhm.
on some pretty powerful statistical tools and media, and all of a sudden you have mass manipulation on a scale that was unimaginable in the past, and it's very dangerous, as we've seen recently.
Well, Merlin, there are so many interesting themes here. I mean, one theme is that, so let me just list a few themes here. One theme is that you're talking about right now is the kind of sanctity of the individual versus mass hysteria. Like, there is a, like, the ability, like a analytical ability, there is a level where each person kind of pays attention to everything that they think should be paid attention to, all the knowledge, and
Mm-hmm.
tries to put it together in a painstaking way
Yeah,
in order to produce something. And and this is not just an intellectual product, but that is something, could be like a foundation of a system that supports life, like an engineering project or something like that,
right.
which requires enormous amount of careful, precise thought. That, as opposed to just kind of these fads or things that where people just get carried away in kind of just almost like a, it's a emotional. So like there is a completely pure emotional
Yeah.
reaction in the culture
Yeah, well,
versus this
surfing the
thoughtful.
web is sort of like wandering through a forest, isn't it? I mean, and
Mhm.
just looking at things that you're interested in, as opposed to this high pressure, concentrated. Let's say you're working at Fermi Lab.
Mhm.
Well, there's not a lot of room for anything else. I mean, you just got to. I know that when I was doing electrophysiology as a young
Mhm.
scientist, uh, you didn't have. I lost for a period of time my intellect. I was totally owned by the discipline because to stay on top of all the latest statistical techniques, electronic techniques, technology, et cetera, getting grants, all that. There's no room for anything else. You know what I mean? So are you a human being still? Well, that's debatable. I mean, yes, you're a human being, especially if you have enough constraints on your behavior. But and human beings can take many different forms. But highly specialized people are uh, literally employed, right? Employed in the literal sense by the system. They're functions of a management diagram somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I had a colleague at Stanford years ago. I used to go down to Stanford a lot for certain things for about 10 or 15 years, who was an engineer, worked on big construction projects. And he developed a software program which was very influential in some very large mergers. I think I remember the merger of Hewlett Packard and some other big company. And what he did was very simple. He he knew that he couldn't model the cognitive systems of individuals. We don't know enough about
Mm-hmm.
brains and people. So he assumed a match between the man and the job.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they canceled one another out.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked only at exception handling.
Mm-hmm.
So when the system's working and an exception comes up, where do they go? And in this way, he could analyze corporate cultures and predict the success of a merger of two businesses. And if they had a different strategy and exception handling, it wasn't a good sign. In other words, you can almost delete the
Mm-hmm.
humanity of people,
Mm-hmm.
um, and in that kind of situation, and rely entirely on fit to the system. So there is always a danger in especially with very bright people that they'll get sucked into a system that's totally absorbing and leaves no room for any just life,
Mm-hmm.
spontaneity, beauty,
So
etc.
another angle I want to take is to look at specific technology. Let's talk about television. How did the mind change, or how did the way in which people use consciousness changed after television?
Well, there's one thing I'll tell you: we've never studied what watching, let's say, 10,000 violent cartoons does to a kid, right, to their brains, to their limbic systems, or whatever, let alone what happens to you when you immerse yourself in endless numbers of sitcoms and whatever. I do think that some of the nihilism in our culture, which is so widespread, is a product of the media, especially television. But you could also argue that television is just responding to our own nihilism, but it's sort of a feedback loop. It's a positive feedback loop, right? It's a classic situation. So these media, which are so in some ways liberating, are also uh, potentially explosive devices. They are. I'm very concerned about this, and I have um, been concerned about whether we can handle what we're doing. Um, that includes mass culture and especially social networks now that are somewhat getting out of control. And I don't think the legislators are even in the ballpark of what they need to do. But of course, legislation takes generations to change, and technology can change in 6 months.
Mhm.
So that's
It's
a real.
interesting. I mean, the most fascinating thing is digital, because it seems to, like, if you want to do a TikTok video and imitate dancing of other people, you can do that.
Mm-hmm,
If you want to do the oral culture, you can do that.
mm-hmm,
It's kind of like it's printing on steroids. It is TV on steroids.
yep.
And then there is this universal memory of everything that you want to know is there if you want to use it. So what do you see is the potential and the danger of digital?
Well, I think the danger is the more obvious. It's very hard to predict where this is going to go because I was reading some Ray Bradbury's short stories the other day, and there's some very, very funny to see some of these things. Even someone that sophisticated was assuming that life would be like in the 21st century. And of course, it's hilariously wrong in some things. We were all supposed to be driving around in flying cars in the year 2003. Well, not quite. So I think in matters of the mind, it's exactly the same thing. Nobody expected that. Uh, First of all, nobody even predicted things like social media, but nobody expected that that phones, the supposed phones, which are really computers, would mostly end up being vehicles for sending photographs and videos back and forth. Um, which is what they are. So in a sense, we're moving away from text. We're moving away from literacy. I would say the one of the dangers of what's happening now is that the elite is becoming much less literate than it was. So technically, more people can type, more people can read a sentence, and so on. But we'll talk about high-level literate skills. The elite's less literate, not more literate, in my view. A lot less literate. Try to get most scientists to read anything more than 3 pages long, and their eyes gloss over. I mean, they're not used to the old-fashioned. One of my favorite scholars is a guy named Jan Huizinga. I don't know if you know his work, but he's a medievalist of a previous generation, very famous man in the Netherlands. Died in just after the war. The Nazis went after him, and he he was a fantastic classical mind, just cosmic in its reach, just staggering the things he knew and had right at his fingertips, and the number of languages and so on. And that kind of thing is going out, and we get these hard-driven, highly specialized people who often don't give a thought to anything else. I mean, they're working on mining systems and colonies on Mars, and half the world is living in sludge in plastic bags and starving to death. I mean, what?
Yes.
So there is a strange lack of a certain type of literacy at the top of the system right now, which is very concerning. And it's an odd thing, because you would think, hell, we're so much more literate than we are. Well, I'm not so much. Depends on what you call literacy.
Wow. Wow.
Technically, you know,
Wow.
we thought that just put the circuits in the brain so you could read a sentence and you're going to get smarter. Well, not so much.
Wow. Let me ask another kind of flip side of that question. Yes, this technology can be used by idiots for anything. and people can, abuse it. People can basically satisfy a much lower need of almost a primate need using this. So all of that, granted. Yep. But at the same time, I just want to focus on the potential, because I'm coming back to the remark that you had, is that the analytical culture or theoretical culture, even when only a small fraction of people had it, it was the determining thing. It was the thing that was keeping things going. It was the thing that moved the world forward. So in that spirit, what is the potential of digital? Because today, if you want, the amount of knowledge that is accessible to you is just incredible. So if you can create a subculture or a culture along the lines of, let's say, Pericles or Aristotelian school, the peripatetic school today, what would it look like? What is the potential of that?
Yes, you're talking about Castelia, or one of Hermann Hesse's type of concepts of this intellectual utopia, etc. Well, that's maybe possible with a combination of intensive education and very selective use of, but it would only be possible in a world where an elite was protected from real life, totally protected and secure, militarily and financially, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so you get high art in those situations in history. You can say of the caves of Lascaux, some people at that time, even at that time, were secure enough to do something like that and not spend every day just surviving, and surviving not just because life is hard when you're very sort of don't have any protections or any services, but also because you'd be attacked by other people and put down. So it's a tough one. I mean, yes, in theory, you could uh, achieve a very high level of awareness, and in fact, some people have. I think using technology and are using even drugs with technology. But by and large, I'd say it's the other way around. That we have to rehumanize ourselves, or somehow recoup the things that we're losing in terms of sensibilities to the needs of other people. You think of this. Uh, I'm thinking of mostly the far right, but the far left isn't a lot better, to tell you the truth. You see people who somebody's lying on the gutter begging, and the guy says, "Get a fucking job." What kind of a culture is that? I mean, that's one of the worst cultures in the history of the world. I don't know a hunter-gatherer culture where that would happen. How did we get like that?
Mm-hmm.
Or someone who would. So one of the, you can talk what you want about mythic culture and Christianity and so on, but one of the best benefits of that, and even Islam, which gets such bad press, but in fact, if you go to Turkey or any country that's Islamic and look on the streets in the neighborhoods, they're very good to one another. They're very supportive. People are with any income must contribute a certain percentage to the benefit of the community, and they have all kinds of services. The church used to do that in the Western Christianity, the monks and nuns, and so the orphanages and the schools, and so all the social services came that way initially, and then of course the idealism after the Second World War created a lot of social services, but that all went out the window the last 30 years of this neoliberal bullshit. But on the other side, you have on the left an equally angry put down and denial of any kind of disagreement with orthodoxy right now, which is almost as bad as the Puritans were, which is very bad when you look at some of the things they did. Hanging entire communities of people, that kind of thing. I mean, we have a uh, a tendency to lapse into really barbarous behavior. And you can talk about the media and the potential of the media for a well-fed, well-paid, secure, well-educated person to use it for enlightenment. But there is another moral argument to make that that's an obscene thing to do at this time in history.
Wow. So I want to follow up on just one thing that you said here. You talked about kind of going back to the human values, or kind of retrieving the kind of what we have lost. So, with everything that is possible, I mean, the question that we really need to ask is, what is human? What is the idea? What is the moral? What is it that we should aim for? For example, people like Aristotle, people like Aquinas, many thinkers, like if you look at founding fathers, they spent a lot of time thinking about what is the good,
That's
what
right.
should be, what is a human being, and what can we be, and what should we be. Is that what you're talking about when you say you need to retrieve what what we have lost?
Yes, but I think that the analytic approach in that case, it doesn't necessarily get you there. It's a very interesting thing. For example, Immanuel Kant built this incredible intellectual edifice, and what does he come to? The golden rule at the end of the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
The categorical imperative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we can overkill the analytic approach, the theoretic approach. We have some instincts that have gotten us through a lot of things for decency and common sense. And so now it's true that in earlier cultures we romanticized them. I mean, they were horrible to anyone they conquered, right? It was just standard fare that you enslaved them or killed the elite and so on. They all did that. Everyone did that. But we do have a side of us um, that is more humane. How do you get that to the front lines? How do you get that to overrule the psychopaths? You know, the sort of running of society as a protection racket. You know, you need us because their warriors are more psychopathic than our warriors. You know, so therefore we own you. That is basically a protection racket. That used to be called aristocratic rule, and if you were in the court, it was nice. You were secure, but nobody else was. You were a farmer. They just come and take all your grain if they needed it or whatever, you know. It has changed a little bit in a better direction, I think, in that sense, with technology and so on. But I mean, one of my concerns is how can you use all this technology for positive things? And you know, somebody should get Zuckerberg and give his head a shake. Say, look, you know, Facebook, you're in this position of power. How can you use this for good?
Yes.
Forget about making more billions. For God's sake, that's a psychosis. Nobody can even spend that much money. So forget about it and figure out how do you use this for the common good. And that's what we should be thinking about. The problem is the politicians are just thinking about the next election and so on and so on. It's not easy. But I don't. I'm not saying that it's wrong to pursue fantasies about sort of intellectual utopias, or what I think it was Hesse called Castelias, but it's not realistic. I mean, most of the time we're just people trying to get through the day, you know, and there are these great moments, these peak experiences that can happen. But can you beat a Baroque opera? You know, the merger of poetry and music at a very high level. A really good one. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Wow. Merlin, this is an incredible conversation. I just love it, but I want to give a chance for my friends to talk amongst themselves. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms. They will last. You will be in one of the breakout rooms. They will last for about 20 minutes. Where folks, so the rules of the breakout rooms, please give chance for everybody to talk for 2 minutes about what their takeaways are, what the big questions are on their mind, and then discuss that amongst yourself. And then in 20 minutes, we'll come back automatically here, and then you will get to talk about your takeaways and ask questions to Merlin.
Just to understand, I should keep my mouth shut, basically.
No. You can just go ahead and answer. You know, there will be a bunch of people in the breakout room. You can go back and forth with them. And then after that, all of us will come back here, and then people will have questions for you.
Got it.
All right. Thank you very much, folks. I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. So it's going to be Brian, Kevin, and Jennifer. Brian, go ahead.
So, Merlin, in the group that we were just in, someone had asked a question, and you mentioned this idea of the fourth transition. And I was wondering if you could briefly comment on what you think that fourth transition might look like.
Merlin, you need to unmute yourself. Merlin, you need to unmute yourself.
How do I unmute? Okay, it's unmute.
Done.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. I've published a recent paper, and if I make it available, Srikant, can you circulate
absolutely.
it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll do that. I've only begun to articulate this. The idea is to lay out the same criteria I used for the first three transitions. That is restructuring of the mental architecture of people, plus the introduction of at least one additional qualitatively new representational system. So I'm examining that possibility. Where it can go is very unpredictable because you really can't predict, as we know very well. Human beings are very inventive creatures in both positive and negative sense. But I'm essentially looking at that table that I have and elaborating it and saying, can I justify now 25 years? I've been asked that question so many times, you know, in public lectures and so on. Is there a fourth transition? And this is the first time I felt that maybe that's possible to talk about, because up till now I haven't really seen that. But I think with AI, with virtual reality, with a whole bunch of changes that are occurring in terms of both possibilities for art and other kinds of thinking, I think it's a valid question now. It's open for, you know, and it's important to think about. But it's also important to remember that most of human culture persists. It keeps going. So, you know, we're still mimetic, we're still mythic, we're still, but are we moving away from beyond the theoretic? That's an interesting question. It's entirely possible.
Thank you. When Merlin sends me the link to the paper, I will go ahead and post it on the meetup page, so you'll all have it. Okay. Next up is going to be Kevin, Jennifer, Trevor, and David. Folks, keep your questions brief. Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Hi, Merlin. I'm curious about the sound of a word. Like, how far can we track back for first word? Like, it sounds like mom, dad, papa. That's similar to today. Like, do we have those kind of research? Thank you.
I don't think I fully understood that question.
Kevin's question is, how far back can we trace the history of individual words like mama or papa? Or
well, I think etymology is one of my favorite hobbies, but I go back to the history. I used to be a member of an association called ASLEP, the Association for the Study of Languages in Prehistory, which is a really interesting group of people, mostly linguists, far more knowledgeable about language than I am, but they're based in Boston. They go back 10, 20,000 years in terms of the ancestors of current languages. We're part of the Indo-European system. So that includes all of the languages of what we call, most of the languages of what we call the West and the Indian subcontinent, from you know, Persian and Russian and German and so on, all of those languages. And there's very clear lines of descent. So all our words are descended from proto words or proto-language words that go back thousands of years. It's a very interesting thing to study, but it's an entire discipline in its own right. You know.
Next up is Jennifer. Jennifer, what's your question?
So our group ended up derailing and going off into a discussion of linguistics, which was fascinating. One of the pithy sayings that I took from your talk, Merlin, was the library as walking through the noosphere, which I thought was fabulous. I brought that up in our discussion, and I'm wondering if you could just kind of unpack that a little bit. I have an idea of what you meant by that, but I'm curious to see if it matches with yours.
You know, I wrote a paper many years ago called "The Revolutionary Function of Languages: Memory Palaces." Revolutionary function of libraries. I'm sorry. I think libraries they take advantage of our incredible ability to move in three-dimensional space. And they also take advantage of the old Greek method of loci in memory, you know, where you create a memory palace and you walk through the palace and you open a drawer and it contains the laws of real estate or something, or another drawer contains the names of the Greek gods or something like that. And people used to be trained in that method right up into the Renaissance in oral culture, so they could learn enormous. I mean, lawyers didn't have papers in front of them. They had to do everything from memory, all of the codices and so on. So, you know, libraries sort of moved beyond that, because once you could store ideas in some kind of compact form, the Library of Alexandria would have been scrolls. In modern libraries, it's books, or, you know, of course now digital. But you can physically move through space to histology, you know, or zoology, or archaeology, and then the possibilities for serendipity are amazing. You don't have that in the internet. You can't do that. It's all linear. You have to know where you're going, exactly where you're going. Well, how can you do that? You end up relying on AI or some other method, but it's not the same. I think you lose a lot by not being able to just wander through the ideosphere, the noosphere, whatever you want to call it, and, you know, oh, that's an interesting book, you know, and take it out, look at it. It's an amazing thing. I mean, you're moving back 2,000 years and picking up the work of somebody who wrote, you know, something in Rome in the year 30 or something, you know. It's amazing. And and so because you do that in space, you remember it much better, because we're so good at that.
Thank you. Next up is Trevor David Govert. Next, Trevor.
Hi, Merlin. You spoke about the requirements needed to move into a fourth transition. I'm wondering, have you ever thought about how some of these requirements could be implemented on a new social media platform of some sort? So like Facebook, but something that has facilitating this transition as a goal, as opposed to just providing endless.
I think that personally, I think that would be very dangerous to put that kind of power in the hands of a private industry
let's assume we have a benevolent dictator. Could it be done?
It's hard to say. I mean, propaganda works. And we know in the case of Trump's and his party that misinformation, systematic, aggressive, packaged misinformation works just as well as information. You can brainwash people to all kinds of crazy things, right? So it's potentially mischievous. And if you combine that with AI and virtual reality, it's a very scary possibility. The average person is just simply no defense against that. The average individual, in fact, even highly trained and sophisticated individuals, if you learn their tricks, the few tricks they have, you could probably get them too. So I think it's potentially total mind capture, very dangerous.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David, Govert, and Mike. David.
Hi, Merlin. Pleasure to speak with you, and thanks for the very insightful presentation. I was wondering if you could comment on the fact that I've heard that not every person has an inner verbal monologue. And so how does that relate to the fact that not everybody actually has a thought, a verbal in their mind?
I think that's true. I mean, when James wrote about that, the birth of these inner conversations and so on, I think he made an absolute judgment that was too absolute. That is, we still have people who are living in the mindset of 25,000 years ago. We have other people who are living in on the edge. I mean, everything and anything goes. Okay, so you can't sort of generalize and say this is true of for everybody. But the inner conversation, as somebody who's not young anymore, I can tell you that as you get older, your inner conversation gets really kind of interesting. So if you see a lot of people sort of mumbling to themselves as they walk down the street, it's probably because their inner conversations are going like crazy. You're reflecting on your life, you're reflecting on all kinds of things that have happened and so on. It's important, it's vital. But I think there are people, I think first of all, it is culturally specific. I think that there were cultures in which that just didn't happen. Of course, it's something we've been extensively trained to do. You know, I mean, when Proust wrote what he did in supposedly trying to reconstruct his memory, was quite revolutionary at the time. You know, people do that kind of thing all the time now. But what did they do it 100 years earlier? I'm not sure they did. I mean, it's hard to say. Those are things that's why I say don't underestimate the power of culture to completely change the way you think.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Govert, Mike, and Seth. Govert, what's your question?
Right.
I would like to know from Dr. Donald, and we talked about it a little bit, his paradigmatic idea of those stages of evolution of culture and cognition found great application in the work of Catherine Nelson.
Yes.
Where else is what I think is a very fruitful, I used it in my dissertation, where else did your work find that kind of fruitful application?
I did mention in Robert Bella's very important book on religion and evolution and the history of the major religions, and especially during the Axial Age, he relied on it completely. He used it extensively. It's also being used a lot in archaeology. It had a big impact on archaeology, on modern archaeological thinking. There's it's used in quite a few fields, actually, the cultural fields, quite a few, including anthropology, but I'd say more in archaeology. I can't follow everything. I don't know for sure, but there are a lot of different fields that use some of these ideas.
Let me ask you the question in the other direction. Which thinkers have you learned most from in understanding?
That's a tough one. I mean, I followed so many fields that I'm indebted to many people, and you know, that's true of any thinker. I mean, but I'd say early on, you know, the person who got me most interested in philosophy was Bernard Lonergan, who was a well-known neo-scholastic thinker, very analytic, maybe too analytic for his own good. And then Northrop Frye and of course McLuhan had an impact. He had a big impact because he's so smart. You know, he was in person, brilliant guy. I mean, there were there's just so many. I mean,
of course, yeah. No, this is great. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Seth. Mike, quick question, please. 20 seconds.
Well, 20 seconds. A number of people in the audience here have expressed agreement with you, and people not in the audience talk about that this definitely evolved, and that something happened at the beginning of the Bronze Age and the end of the Bronze Age. The disagreement may be in terms of whether this occurred 1 million years ago or exponentially blossomed at the time of the Bronze Age. Also, whether there's been some resets, and there's a guy named Greg Hancock, who said that there might have been 3 major archaeological resets in the last million years.
Yes, well, I think certainly the Bronze Age was an age of, so many things happened in that time that it would have been very surprised if major changes didn't occur. But that would depend on which Bronze Age culture, and if you only look at Mycenae in Greece, or certain periods in certain places, you may get a misimpression, but I know James was focused on Mycenae and mostly on I assume Minoan civilization, that kind of thing, because we had a long history of written documents and so on to go on, and we knew something about the language. We know a lot more now about the archaeology, but I'm not so fixed on that fine a time scale. I think that these things happen gradually, gradualistically, using a Darwinian term, and also that some of these changes are purely cultural, some of them are technological. Not too many of these changes, once you get to anatomically modern humans, were biological changes, although many people look exclusively, at that dimension. So it gets more complicated than that. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying he was wrong. I'm just saying it maybe a bit selective in the way he looked at it. That there are many different Bronze Age cultures, and you'd have to know much more to make a generalization. That's all.
Thank you. Merlin, have you looked at other large civilizations like India and China to see
Personally,
the culture? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
mean, I know a little bit about them, mostly through reading what people in the West have said about them. I don't speak any or read any of those languages, so I can't draw on my own personal experience of them. But my impression is that when you look at the axial age discussions that have gone on, that both India and China, of course, were part of that, and claims have been made that they were moving towards analytic thought. I think you can sort of make the case. In India, it's difficult because there aren't so many written texts, and a lot of the tradition was carried through oral transmission. But I mean, I'd say read Bella. Bella is really good on that, and he may convince you of his point of view, or he may not.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Seth. Seth, go ahead.
Yep.
Yes. Hi. So my question would be what your thoughts are on the human consciousness ever evolving past our physical form, and while I'm asking if it could ever evolve past our individual form.
Well, I think my second book, Minds So Rare, I spell out what my criteria are for making that judgment, and in a sense, I was too formulaic in that book, but it is, I think, the case that as consciousness expanded, because that's what it really did, it included a wider spatial temporal synthesis or ability to integrate across space and time. So, if you look at a frog jumping at a fly, there is a very narrow band of consciousness. If it is, you have to get his attention, and he catches the fly, but it's pretty limited. But if you look at a primate, and then you look through the various stages of human development and evolution, it's always a case of widening the reach of attention and working memory. And then we have this remarkable ability to stack layers of attention and automatize them on top of one another. So when we do incredibly complicated things like playing the piano at a concert pianist level, the concert pianist can literally zoom down to his finger or pull way back up to a high level interpretation, and any number of other ways in between. We don't know how he does that, but that's the way it happens, and that's true of writers and so on. We have a kind of zoom function, but at its maximum inclusion, I think it's a good way to determine where we are as individuals. And that's influenced a lot by technology and culture. That is, we have I think the biggest change in my lifetime in the West is a historiographic change. We see the past so differently from in the way anybody else in the history has ever seen it. And I'm not talking about professional historians. I'm just talking through recreations and all kinds of high-tech movies and so on. We have a different take on it. Now, it may not always be accurate, but it's a totally different sense of time. Well, that's a high-level integration function that is very much tied to technology, and so it's complicated, and it's. But I'll maybe leave it at that.
Wonderful. Merlin, everybody is very excited about the paper that you're going to send me.
Yes.
On the fourth transition. And most of us will read it. I certainly will read it. And if we have questions about it, would you be able to come back and talk to us about it?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. I'd be delighted.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Last question is from Brian McQuay. Brian.
Okay.
Brian, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I see. This isn't a question, it's just a comment. And what I'd like to say is why I think your work is so important is because compared to a lot of other mainstream psychologists, for lack of a better term, you really take culture and socialization as something that are so vital, real important ingredients to what it means to be human. And the other thing I'd like to take, the other thing I appreciate very much is in a lot of evolutionary psychology is a bit simplistic, but my reading of your work is actually very sophisticated. There's a tendency to reduce a lot of elements of what it means to be human in evolutionary psychology.
Oh, yes.
But with you, of course, as I said, you take a much more nuanced, a more subtle view of what it means to be human. I think that comes down to this idea that we are very, as you put it, very protean creatures, that there's a lot of plasticity to what it means to be human.
Yes, I think, I mean, evolutionary psychology, for the most part, as it's been popularized, especially, is too simplistic, and it also is sometimes not respectful, especially of religion, which is almost caricatured, but also of a mythic culture in general, and they simply, almost dismiss it as unsophisticated superstition or something like that, which just completely misses the point, But anyway, I think nevertheless, some of them are very nice people. I just don't necessarily agree with such judgmental approach, but I think it's true there are superstitious people, and many of them are seculars, atheists. There's many of them are scientists. I mean, so what's wrong with superstition? I mean, there's a lot of questions that you have to ask of that. But I think most of religion is just a custom that gives people a center of gravity, and they know who they are and what they should value. That's what's really important, and they're not interested in the technicalities of theology or some damn thing. They have the slightest clue. That's an elite occupation, strictly for the courtiers.
We'll take one last question from Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I always bring up culture in all of our different meetups. I was curious as to what would be the biological function in our cognitive brain for art? If we're looking at this potential fourth transition, is
Yes.
there a place for art in conserving culture and like thus humanity?
Absolutely. Actually, I have a talk I gave at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland in 2006 that addresses that exact question. Would you be interested in a link to that?
Absolutely. So
Yeah,
when
okay,
you
I'll give you
when you
that.
send me the one on the fourth transition, I will go ahead and put a link to that on the meetup page as well. So
Okay.
we'll talk about both of them.
Yeah.
All right. So Merlin, this has been an incredible honor and incredible pleasure. This is just
for me too. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I'm glad you did, and we'll see you soon.
Okay.
All right. Thank
Bye
you,
now.
everybody.
Yeah,
Bye.
yeah.